In the autumn of 1887, people across the Dakota Territory's James River Valley watched a widow begin a project that struck them as senseless. Maren Halvorsen was cutting snow into blocks and stacking them against her cabin. Not near the cabin, against it. The first row sat directly against the foundation logs, forming a low wall that wrapped the entire structure. Each block had been cut with care, shaped square, then pressed firmly into place. The work began the morning after the first real storm of the season, long before most of her neighbors had even cleared their wagon paths. At first, a few travelers assumed she was banking snow against the walls the way many homesteaders did during the coldest months. But banking was simple work. A man with a shovel could finish in an afternoon. What Maren was doing took days. She measured every block. She trimmed the edges with a long carpenter's knife. She fitted them together the way a stone mason might fit a foundation, each one resting against the next without gaps wide enough to slide a blade through. Her 8-year-old daughter, Annika, walked behind her, smoothing the joints with a small flat board. Nearby, a gray herding dog named Skugga lay watching them in the cold light, ears forward, tail curled against the snow. By the end of the first week, the bottom row had circled the cabin on all 4 sides. Then Maren began a second one above it. That was when people started paying attention. Every short day on the northern plains was too valuable to waste. Stovewood needed splitting. Hay needed hauling from the lower meadows before drifts buried the trails. Livestock needed checking twice a day. Every hour spent on the wrong task could become a problem once winter truly settled in. One afternoon, from across the section line, the freighter Cyrus Penn slowed his team and watched the work for a long moment. He had been hauling supplies along that road for 14 years. He had never seen anyone do what the Halvorsen widow was doing. Finally, he called out across the cold air, "What are you building there?" Maren straightened, set down her knife, and answered without hesitation, "A second wall, nothing else." No explanation followed, no reasoning offered. Just those 4 words. Cyrus looked at the cabin, then at the growing ring of snow blocks, then back at the widow. The answer explained less than the question. By the time the second row was halfway finished, people throughout the James River Valley were talking about the strange Halvorsen place. By the dead of winter, many of them would wish they had listened more carefully. That talk reached the general store first, then the church on Sunday, then the blacksmith's shop where men gathered on cold afternoons, waiting for orders and discussing other people's decisions. Before long, the name had taken hold. The snowblock cabin. The widow who buried her own house. Holly's Brand, who controlled most of the valley's winter credit through his store ledger, called the project a waste of strength that could have been spent splitting more cordwood. Eldon Krieger, a builder who had raised soddies and frame houses from Iowa to the Yellowstone, laughed when he first saw the structure go up. "Snow melts," he said. "You can't build a wall out of something that won't be there in the spring." Most people agreed. The nickname stuck. Maren heard it. Everyone did. The valley was too small for anything else, yet the rows kept rising. Week after week, she worked among the blocks without defending herself, without correcting anyone, without offering explanations. Skugga moved with her. Annika followed behind. The silence only deepened the talk, and somewhere beneath the amusement, a few people began wondering whether the widow understood something they did not. The Halvorsen homestead sat alone on a long rise 3 miles north of the trading post, exposed to the open country in every direction. The wind there had nothing to break it for 30 miles in any direction a person cared to look. In a hard winter, that prairie became one of the most dangerous stretches of land in the territory, and the widow knew it. The talk around the snowblock cabin continued through the early weeks of winter, but very little changed inside the Halvorsen homestead. A heavy wool coat still hung on a peg behind the door. A pair of leather-palmed mittens rested on the shelf above it. Neither item had been moved since Anders Halvorsen failed to return from a trapping line 3 winters earlier. The line ran along the James River bottoms, and a sudden whiteout had closed in faster than any man could read it. Searchers found his sled 2 miles east of the cabin. They never found him. Some evenings, Skugga would curl against the empty boot rack near the door as if waiting for a familiar step on the floorboards. The dog had belonged to Anders first. Marin had inherited him the same way she had inherited the homestead, the unpaid notes, and the long task of raising their child alone on the open prairie. One night, while the last gray light faded beyond the rise, Annika looked through the small kitchen window toward the growing wall. The snow blocks caught the dying light and held it for a moment, glowing faintly blue against the dusk. Would Father have built it this way? She asked. The question hung in the room longer than the answer ever could. Marin's hands kept working at a length of twine she was knotting into a sled lashing. After a long pause, she glanced toward the window and answered only with a small nod. Outside, the second row of blocks waited in the cold to be joined by a third. The idea had not begun in the Dakota Territory. Years earlier, before Marin married into the Halvorsen family, her own grandmother had spent a season living in a fishing camp far above the Arctic Circle, north of Tromsø in the Old Country. The Sami families who lived there knew things about snow that lowland Norwegians did not. They understood that snow was not simply a problem to be cleared away. It was a material. It could be cut. It could be shaped. It could be made to work. The old woman had described it many times during Marin's childhood, always in the same quiet voice she used when speaking of things she had seen with her own eyes. A wall of packed snow, properly built, did not act like ice. It acted like wool. Inside its body, countless tiny pockets of trapped air refused to let the cold pass through them. The snow itself became the barrier. The wind, finding the wall instead of the timbers, spent its strength against something that did not care. One phrase had stayed with Marin her entire life. The cold is patient. Give it work to do that leads nowhere. At the time, the words had sounded like an old country saying, passed from grandmother to granddaughter without much thought. Years later, standing on a windswept Dakota rise with winter pressing closer every morning, she understood what the old woman had really been describing. Not folklore, a method. One that had already kept the Sami alive through winters far harder than anything the James River Valley had ever produced. The work had a rhythm to it. Each morning, Marin rose before first light and built up the stove. She fed Annika a bowl of barley porridge with a spoonful of preserved cloudberry from the cellar. Then mother and daughter dressed in layers and went out together to cut the day's blocks from a drift that had hardened along the northern fence line. The drift was perfect for the purpose. The wind had packed it tight over several storms. A man could walk across the top without breaking through. With a long bone-handled snow knife her grandfather had brought from Norway, Marin cut blocks 2 feet long, 1 foot high, and 10 inches thick. Each one weighed nearly 40 pounds. Annika could not lift them, but she could steady the sled while her mother loaded. By the end of the second week, the wall stood waist-high on every side of the cabin. The door remained accessible through a narrow, cleared passage. The windows had been left uncovered for now, though Marin had already cut and stored shorter blocks intended for them once the deeper cold arrived. Cyrus Penn passed the place twice during those weeks. He no longer asked questions. He simply watched and rode on. By the end of November, the wall around the Halvorsen cabin had reached the height of the eaves on 3 sides. Only the southern wall, where the door faced the open yard, remained shorter, finished to a height that allowed a person to step over the lowest course without difficulty. Marin had planned that opening deliberately. A door buried in snow was useless. A door reached through a cleared corridor between 2 parallel walls of packed blocks was something else entirely. The corridor itself had taken 3 days to build. 2 short walls extended outward from the doorway like the arms of a small entrance hall, with their own roof of cross-laid blocks resting on a frame of stripped willow poles. The structure looked strange from the outside, almost like a burrow opening cut into the side of a drift. Inside, it created a small dead-air chamber between the cabin door and the open weather, a space where wind could not rush directly into the house each time someone went out for firewood or stove ash. Marin had seen this idea drawn in one of her grandmother's old letters. The Sami called such an entrance by a name she could no longer remember exactly. What mattered was the principle. Two doorways separated by a buffer of still air. The cold could enter the first chamber. It could not easily reach the second. On the morning the corridor was finished, Eldon Krieger rode up to the property with his foreman, a thick-shouldered man named Prout who had helped raise barns from Sioux Falls to the Missouri Breaks. Both men dismounted slowly. Eldon walked the length of the wall, stopping at intervals to press his bare palm against the packed snow. He examined the corridor opening for a long moment without speaking. Then he turned to face Marin. "You understand what's going to happen come spring," he said. "All this comes down in a week of warm weather. A week. Then you've got water running against your foundation logs, and you've spent 3 months of labor for nothing." Marin listened without interrupting. Eldon was not being cruel. He was speaking the way a man speaks who has seen good timber rotted out by spring melt because someone built a hay shed against the wrong wall. He had reasons for everything he was saying. "The wall comes down on purpose," she answered finally. "In March I take it down myself block by block before the thaw arrives. Then the cabin dries through April. By May the logs are no different than your own." Eldon studied her for a long moment. Prout had moved closer to the corridor and was looking inside, his head tilted slightly. "You've thought this through," Eldon said. It was not exactly a compliment. It was something closer to an admission that he had not expected an answer that made sense. The two men did not stay long. As they rode away, Prout looked back over his shoulder more than once. Eldon kept his eyes on the road ahead. That same week, Holly's brand made a different kind of visit. He came on foot from the trading post, bundled in a heavy buffalo coat that had seen better winters, and he did not bother to dismount any pretense of friendliness. He stood at the edge of the cleared corridor and called toward the cabin until Marin came out. "Your account is $42 in arrears," he said. "I can't keep extending credit on flour and lamp oil while you spend your strength on this." He gestured at the wall as if it were the source of every problem on the homestead. Marin met his eyes steadily. "I'll have a portion against the debt by the first week of January," she said. "Pelts from the line my husband used to run. I've been setting the traps myself since the snow came hard enough to track." Hollis grunted. He had not expected that answer. He had expected pleading. He had expected the kind of small humiliation that gave a man like him satisfaction on a cold afternoon. "Pelts by January," he repeated, "or the credit closes." Then he walked back toward the road, his boots crunching the packed snow, and Marin returned to her work. The wind had begun to rise from the northwest. Skugga lifted his head and watched the horizon for a long time before lowering it again to the snow. December arrived with a hardness the older settlers recognized at once. The temperature did not so much fall as settle, the way water settles into a well when the pumping stops. By the second day of the month, the thermometer Marin had nailed to a sheltered post beside the corridor read 11 below zero at sunrise. By the fourth day, it read 19 below. The air itself had taken on a brittle quality, the kind that made tin pails ring like bells when they bumped against a wagon side. Inside the cabin, the wood stove burned at its ordinary pace. Marin had spent autumn cutting and splitting a careful reserve of cottonwood and ash, stacked along the eastern wall under a tarpaulin weighted with stones. The pile was not enormous. Other families in the valley had laid in twice as much. What Marin had was sized to the cabin she intended to heat through the worst of the winter, and the wall outside was the reason that calculation might hold. She had begun keeping a small ledger on the kitchen table the same week she finished the corridor. The book had belonged to Anders, originally used for trapping accounts. Empty pages still made up most of it. Marin filled them now with a different kind of record. Morning temperature outside. Morning temperature inside. Evening readings of both. The number of split logs burned in the previous 24 hours. The weight of the wood, when she had time to weigh a representative armload on the small grocer's scale she had bought used the previous summer. The figures looked tedious to anyone who happened to see them. Most prairie families never bothered measuring winter in such a way. They burned what they had and prayed it lasted. Holly's brand, when he made a second visit during the second week of December to confirm the pelts she had promised, noticed the open ledger on the table and made no effort to hide his amusement. "You can write numbers all day," he said. "That doesn't make a winter shorter." The remark drew a thin smile from Prout, who had come along this time on some business of his own. Marin recorded another entry without looking up. The figures continued accumulating, day after day. Outside the cabin, the valley had begun to issue its own warnings. Old Tobias Renning, who farmed a quarter section south of the river crossing and had red prairie, whether longer than most men in the territory had been alive, began spending more time looking at the northwest sky than speaking to anyone. He had buried 2 wives and outlived 3 of his own children on this land. He knew what the long, quiet horizons meant when they took on that particular shade of pale gray at midday. The geese had already gone weeks earlier than usual. The coyotes had moved closer to the homesteads, hunting near the barns at twilight in a way that suggested the deeper country had nothing left to offer them. A few of the older ranchers had brought their cattle in from the far pastures before the calendar said they should. One afternoon in the middle of December, Tobias rode up to the Havorson place on a thick-bodied mule he favored for cold weather. He dismounted slowly, the way men do when their knees have done too many winters of work, and he walked the length of the wall without saying anything. His gloved hand moved across the blocks at intervals, testing the density. He stopped at the corridor entrance and looked inside for a long moment. Then he turned to Marin, who had come out into the cold to meet him. "Who taught you that?" he asked. "My grandmother," Marin answered. "She lived a season with the Sami north of Tromsø when she was young." Tobias nodded once. He did not laugh, he did not lecture. He simply stood for another long moment looking at the wall and then at the northwestern horizon where the mountains of the Black Hills were no longer visible behind a faint curtain of haze. "Storm coming," he said finally. "Hard one. Could be inside a week." Marin met his eyes. "I know." Tobias climbed back into the saddle. As he rode away, he did not look back. But the visit itself carried weight. A man who had read 40 winters had walked the wall, and he had not laughed. The storm did not arrive in a week. It arrived in 3 days. The morning of December 17th dawned clear and unusually still. The wind that had pushed across the prairie for most of the previous week had died sometime during the night, and the air held a strange, waiting quality that anyone who had lived a Dakota winter recognized at once. Smoke from the cabin chimney rose almost straight up. The dog refused to leave the corridor entrance. He stood there with his ears forward and his weight balanced on all 4 legs, looking north toward the empty horizon. Marin saw the signs before she had finished the morning's chores. The thermometer outside the door read 4 below zero, warmer than it had been all week. That alone was a warning. A sudden warming on the northern plains in mid-December meant only one thing. She spent the morning sealing the cabin in a way she had not done since first finishing the wall. The shorter blocks she had cut and stored for the windows now came out from beneath their tarpaulin. Each window had been measured carefully in the autumn. Each block fit snug against the outer frame, held in place with wedges of cut willow driven between block and timber. Inside, Marin hung the heavy quilted blankets she had sewn during the previous summer over each window casing. Between the outer blocks and the inner blankets, a column of still air would do the same work the wall did, only on a smaller scale. By midday, the cabin was sealed entirely except for the corridor entrance and the stovepipe. Annika worked alongside her mother throughout, carrying tools and steadying the small ladder Marin used to reach the upper windows. Skugga refused to come inside until both of them had finished. The dog stood watch at the corridor mouth as if guarding against something he could already sense coming. The first flakes appeared at 1 in the afternoon. They drifted down slowly at first, lazy and almost decorative against the gray sky. Anyone unfamiliar with the country might have welcomed them. Marin did not. She finished securing the last block over the kitchen window and called Annika inside. By 2, the wind had risen. By 3, it was blowing steadily from the northwest at a speed Marin estimated at 30 miles an hour. By 4, the world beyond the corridor had vanished entirely. What came down upon the James River Valley that afternoon was not snow falling. It was snow being driven horizontally across the open country at a velocity that erased every familiar landmark within minutes. The fence line beside the cabin disappeared first, then the woodshed 20 paces from the door. Then the corridor entrance itself, which the wind began to close with drifts the moment Marin stepped back inside the cabin and barred the inner door. The sound was the thing the children of the prairie remembered longest, those who survived to remember anything. It was not the howling that storybooks described. It was a deep, continuous roar, as though some enormous animal were pressing its body against every wall of the structure at once and breathing without pause. The sound did not stop. It did not weaken. It went on through the afternoon and into the evening and through the night that followed. Inside the Halvorsen cabin, the stove burned at its ordinary pace. Marin checked the thermometer on the inside wall before darkness fully settled. The reading was 63 degrees. She made an entry in the ledger. Then she added a single piece of split ash to the firebox and sat down at the table with Annika to eat a supper of barley stew and dried apples from the cellar. Skugga lay beneath the table with his chin on his paws. Every so often he lifted his head and looked toward the door, but his ears did not flat and his body did not tense. The roar outside was a thing happening at a distance. It was not happening to the room he was in. 3 miles to the south, in a smaller cabin on a less exposed quarter, the Renning family was already feeding their stove faster than they had planned. Tobias had read the storm correctly. He had not, however, expected it to arrive with quite this much speed. By midnight he would be burning his reserve, and the temperature inside his cabin would already have begun a slow, steady decline. The storm did not break during the night. It did not break the following morning. By dawn on December 18th, the wind had been blowing at full force for nearly 18 hours without a single hour of weakening, and the world beyond the Halvorsen corridor had ceased to exist in any practical sense. Anyone who opened a door anywhere in the James River Valley that morning would have looked out into a white wall moving sideways at a speed that made the eyes refuse to focus. Inside the cabin, Marin rose at her ordinary hour and built up the stove. The thermometer on the inside wall read 61 degrees. She added a single split of cottonwood and recorded the figure in her ledger. She had burned through exactly 4 pieces of wood during the night. On an ordinary cold night, she would have burned 6. On the previous winter's worst night, before the wall, she had burned 11. Annika woke an hour later. The child dressed in only her wool stockings and a single layer over her nightdress, which was the same amount of clothing she would have worn on a mild autumn morning. There was no need for more. The cabin held its heat the way a well-banked stove held its coals. Marin spent the morning at small tasks. She mended a tear in one of Anders's old shirts that she had cut down to fit Annika the previous summer. She ground a small portion of coffee beans in the hand mill. She wrote a longer entry in the ledger than usual, recording not only the temperatures and the wood consumption, but a brief note about the way the wall sounded from inside the cabin. The sound was perhaps the strangest thing of all. The roar outside, which would have been deafening against bare timbers, arrived inside the cabin as a low and distant murmur, as if the storm were happening somewhere far down a long hallway. The packed snow of the wall absorbed the noise the same way it absorbed everything else the storm was trying to deliver. Wind, cold, sound. All of it lost itself in the countless small pockets of trapped air that gave the wall its strength. 3 miles to the south, the Renning cabin had begun its long fight in earnest. Tobias was a careful man, and he had laid in more wood than most. But his cabin sat on a low rise with no banking, no double wall, no corridor to break the wind at the door. Each time someone went out to retrieve another armload of wood from the shed, a column of frozen air came back in with them. The stove worked harder. The thermometer crept slowly downward through the morning, from 54 degrees at sunrise to 49 by midday. His wife, Hattie, did not say anything about it. She had been through bad winters before. She watched the wood pile beside the stove and made her own calculation. At their current rate of burn, the inside reserve would last another day and a half. After that, every armload would have to be brought from the shed, which meant fighting the storm each time. She did not know that the shed door, which Tobias had latched but not barred before the storm began, had already torn loose. By mid-morning, half the woodshed contents were buried under a drift that had built against the leeward side. By afternoon, the shed itself would no longer be visible from the cabin window. 2 miles to the east, on a homestead that sat closer to the river, the situation was worse. The Lindgren family, who had arrived in the territory only the previous spring and built a sod-roofed cabin in a hurry before winter, had not properly chinked the gaps between their logs. Now the wind found every one of those gaps and used them. Frost had formed along the inside of the north wall by the second hour of the storm. By the morning of the 18th, 3 of the children were sleeping together in a single bed beneath every blanket in the house, and the youngest had begun to cough in a way that made his mother's hands shake when she changed his swaddling. At the Halvorsen cabin, Annika sat at the table reading aloud from a primer her mother had bought in town the previous fall. Skugga slept beside the stove. The roar outside continued without pause. The storm entered its second night without the slightest sign of weakening. The wind held at the same fierce velocity it had reached on the afternoon of the 17th, and the snow continued to drive sideways across the valley with such force that, in places, it was scouring the ground bare on the windward side of every obstruction, while building drifts 12 and 15 feet high on the leeward side. Anyone who tried to walk in it for more than a few seconds would have lost their bearings completely. 2 strides from a familiar doorway, and a person could no longer find the door behind them. In the years that followed, old settlers in the James River Valley would remember the storm of December 1887 as the 3-day whiteout. The name was not entirely accurate. The wind blew for 57 hours by the closest reckoning anyone managed afterward. Some claimed 60. The exact figure mattered less than the experience of those hours, which was the experience of having the world reduced to whatever lay inside the walls of one's own home. For the Halvorsen cabin, that world remained warm and quiet. Maren slept in her own bed that night for the first time since the storm began. She had spent the previous night in a chair beside the stove, less from worry than from habit. The cabin's performance during the first 24 hours had given her confidence. The wall was working. The corridor was working. The window blocks were working. The stove was burning a little more than half of what it would have burned in an ordinary cabin under the same conditions, and the temperature inside the room had not dropped below 59 degrees at any point. She did not know what was happening at the Renning place. She did not know what was happening at the Lindgren place. She did not know that, 6 miles to the northwest, a young hired hand named Witten had become disoriented while trying to reach the bunkhouse from the stable on a ranch where he had been working only since October, and that his body would not be found until the 3rd day of the thaw, half a mile from the door he had been trying to reach. What she knew was the inside of her own cabin. What she knew was her daughter sleeping in the loft above the stove, and the dog stretched out on the floor beside the wood box, and the small steady sound of the kettle on the back plate of the firebox. What she knew was that the wall her grandmother had described, in a language Maren had not heard spoken aloud in nearly 20 years, was doing what the old woman had said it would do. At the Renning place, Tobias made his first trip to the woodshed at 3 in the morning. He found the shed gone, not destroyed, buried. The drift on its leeward side had grown so large that the structure had simply disappeared inside it. He dug for 40 minutes with a short-handled shovel before he reached the wall of the shed, and another 20 before he could pry open the door against the weight of the snow pressing against it from inside. By the time he returned to the cabin with a single armload of wood, the skin on his cheeks was white in 3 places where frostbite had begun. Hattie pressed a warm cloth against his face for almost an hour before the color returned. At the Lindgren place, the youngest child's cough had become something worse. The mother held him against her chest beside the stove and prayed in a low voice in Swedish, the language she still used when she was frightened. The father had run out of dry chinking material to push into the gaps along the north wall. He had begun stuffing torn pieces of his own woolen shirt into the worst of the openings. At the Halvorson cabin, Marin added a single piece of ash to the stove at 4 in the morning and went back to bed. Skugga lifted his head briefly, then settled again. Annika did not wake. The storm continued. The wall held. The temperature inside the room remained where it had been for 2 days. The ledger on the kitchen table waited for the next morning's entry. Outside, the prairie was being remade. Inside, a child slept warm beneath a single quilt. The storm broke at last on the morning of December 19th, sometime after 10 o'clock. The end did not come gradually. The wind that had blown without pause for more than 2 days simply stopped, the way a man stops talking mid-sentence when he forgets what he was about to say. One moment the roar was there. The next moment it was not. The silence that followed was so complete that, in many cabins across the valley, people sat up from where they had been resting and looked toward the doors as though something had spoken. Marin stepped to the window first. The blocks she had set in the frames remained in place, sealed by the storm's own work into a single mass that no longer distinguished between block and drift. She moved to the corridor door, lifted the inner bar, and pushed. The door opened 6 inches before it stopped against something solid. The outer corridor entrance had been buried. She did not allow herself to feel anything about that. She returned to the stove, added a piece of wood, and prepared a hot breakfast for Annika. Then she put on her heaviest coat and her father's old beaver fur hat, took down the long-handled shovel from its peg, and went to work. It took her nearly 2 hours to clear the corridor entrance. The drift on the leeward side of the cabin had built to a height that buried the eaves on the south wall completely. She did not try to clear that. She worked only on the corridor, cutting a passage straight up and then outward, until daylight broke through and the cold, thin air of the post-storm prairie reached her face for the first time in 57 hours. What she saw when she stepped fully outside was a country that had been rewritten. Fences were gone. Roads were gone. The trail to the trading post existed somewhere beneath 6 feet of compacted drift. The woodshed, which had stood 20 paces from the cabin, was a low white mound that gave no hint of the structure beneath it. The sky overhead was a pale and bottomless blue, and the temperature was 31 degrees below zero. The cabin itself, viewed from outside, looked less like a building than a feature of the landscape. The snow wall had taken on its own coat of driven snow, sealing every joint and crevice, until the entire structure resembled a low, rounded mound rising from the prairie floor with a single thin column of smoke drifting up from its center. A man riding past at a distance would not have recognized it as a homestead at all. Marin stood for a long moment looking at her own work. Then she went back inside to check on Annika and the dog. The first visitor arrived in the late afternoon. Cyrus Penn had taken his lightest sled and his strongest team, and was making the rounds of every homestead along his old freight route, not because anyone had asked him to, but because that was what men did after a storm of that severity. He had already stopped at 3 places. At one of them he had found everyone alive but cold. At another he had helped dig out a shed door so the family could reach their remaining oats. At the third he had found nobody home and had ridden on with a knot in his stomach that he would not speak about for the rest of his life. When he came over the rise toward the Halvorson place, he stopped his team and stared. The cabin appeared to be intact. The smoke from the chimney rose steady and thin. And as he watched, the corridor door opened and the widow stepped out into the cold with a wooden bucket in her hand, walking unhurriedly toward the small drift she had set aside for melt water. Cyrus rode the rest of the way down without speaking. He tied his team to a post he had to dig partly clear before he could use it, and he approached the cabin slowly. Marin met him at the corridor mouth. He looked past her, into the small chamber of still air, and then through the inner door at the warm room beyond, where Annika sat at the table with a slate and a piece of chalk. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he removed his hat. "I have to ask you something," he said. Marin stepped aside and gestured him into the corridor. Cyrus ducked through the low entrance, removed his snow-crusted boots in the small chamber, and passed through the inner door into the cabin proper. The warmth that met him there was not the warmth of a stove fighting against the cold. It was the warmth of a room that had not been cold in 3 days. He stood for a moment in the middle of the floor, looking at the walls, at the thermometer, at Annika, at the dog stretched comfortably beside the woodbox. The thermometer read 62 degrees. Cyrus had spent the previous 2 nights in his own cabin, which sat on a quarter section north of the trading post, and during the worst of the storm, his thermometer had read 38. He had worn his coat indoors for most of the second day. "How much wood did you burn?" he asked finally. Marin handed him the ledger. He sat at the table and read through the entries with the slow concentration of a man who had spent most of his life with numbers, but rarely with numbers like these. He compared the figures across the storm days. He compared them against the cold mornings before the storm. He compared them against what he knew of his own consumption in his own cabin during the same hours. The Halvorsen cabin had burned less than half of what his own had burned. The temperature inside it had remained more than 20 degrees higher. He closed the book and looked at her. "Tobias was right about you," he said. Marin did not ask what he meant. Cyrus did not explain. He stood, walked to the nearest wall, and placed his palm flat against the timbers. The logs were warm, not hot, not heated, steady, holding their temperature the way a banked coal holds its heat through a long night. He was quiet for a long time, then he asked the question he had come to ask. "The Lindgren place, the young family near the river, do you know them?" "Only by name," Marin said. "The youngest child died last night," Cyrus said. "The mother is sick now. The father is doing what he can. I'm going there next. I came here first because I needed to see this with my own eyes before I went on." The cabin was silent except for the small sound of the kettle on the stove. Annika had stopped writing on her slate. Skugga had lifted his head from his paws. Marin did not speak immediately. She walked to the window where the blocks still sat in their frames, and she looked at the inside of them without seeing them. After a moment she turned back to Cyrus. "I'll come with you," she said. "I can show the father how to seal a wall in a week. It will not bring back the child. It might keep the mother alive. It might keep the others from coughing the way that one did." Cyrus nodded once. Marin dressed Annika in every layer the child owned. She would not leave her behind in an empty cabin, even one as warm as this one, with the country in the condition it was in. Skugga came with them. The three of them rode out in Cyrus's sled with a sack of cut willow wedges, the bone-handled snow knife, and a long bundle of cord that Marin had cut from her own reserve. They reached the Lindgren place an hour before dark. Marin did not speak much during the work. She showed the father how to cut blocks from the hardest drift on the leeward side of his own shed. She showed him how to fit them against the north wall first, because that was the wall the wind would punish hardest in the next storm. She helped him hang quilts inside every window and showed him where to drive the willow wedges to seal the worst of the gaps along the upper logs. By the time full dark came, the north wall of the Lindgren cabin was banked to the height of a man's chest with packed snow blocks, and the inside of the cabin had begun slowly to warm. The mother sat beside the stove with her remaining children. She did not say anything to Marin. She only reached out and took the widow's hand in both of her own for a long moment before letting it go. Marin returned home with Annika and Skugga the following morning. The country between the Lindgren place and her own had begun to take on the strange beauty that the prairie always wore after a great storm. The drifts had sculpted themselves into long curving shapes that caught the low winter sun, and the air itself was so clear that the line of the Black Hills was visible again on the far western horizon for the first time in weeks. Word of what had happened spread before she did. Cyrus Penn was not a man who talked much under ordinary circumstances, but he had ridden through 3 days of country he would never forget, and he had seen with his own eyes the difference between a cabin that fought the storm and a cabin that did not. He told the story at the trading post on the 22nd of December. He told it at the blacksmith's shop on the 23rd. By Christmas Eve, every family in the James River Valley had heard some version of the account. Holly's brand was the first to come to the Halvorsen cabin afterward, and he did not come about the credit. He stood at the corridor entrance with his hat in his hands and asked, with a kind of stiffness that did not suit him, whether the widow would be willing to explain her methods to others in the valley before the next storm came. He said the word others as though it cost him something to say it. Marin agreed. Through the rest of that winter, she walked or rode to 11 different homesteads in the valley and showed the men and women there how to cut blocks from packed drifts, how to set them against the windward walls, how to build a corridor entrance, how to seal windows with willow wedges and quilted blankets. Eldon Krieger came with her to several of these visits, watching the work and asking questions that were not the questions of a man who needed convincing, but the questions of a man who wanted to understand. By February, Eldon had refined a method of his own for cutting and setting the blocks more quickly. He gave Marin full credit for the principle when he spoke of it. By March, when the thaw finally came, the walls came down across the valley exactly as Marin had predicted, block by block, and the timbers beneath them dried through April without rot. The next winter in 1888, when the great blizzard struck eastern Dakota and killed 235 people across the territory in a single afternoon, every homestead in the James River Valley that had built a wall the autumn before survived without serious loss. 6 families lost no one. 3 families took in neighbors from outside the valley who had walked or ridden through the storm to reach them. The Halvorson cabin sheltered 9 people during the worst hours, including the Lindgren mother, who had recovered, and her 3 remaining children. Years passed. Annika grew into adulthood. Skugga's muzzle turned white and his steps became slower, and he eventually died on a warm afternoon in the spring of 1893, asleep in the patch of sun beside the door he had guarded through the whiteout. Anders Halvorson's coat still hung on its peg behind that door. The mittens still rested on the shelf above. Neither item had been moved. Outside, each autumn brought a familiar sight across the valley: the cutting of blocks, the building of walls, the fitting of window pieces, the clearing of corridors. Children grew up assuming the walls had always been built that way. New arrivals copied the methods without knowing where they had come from. The idea had outlived the laughter that had once surrounded it, which was the fate of most useful knowledge on the frontier. People rarely remembered the doubts. They rarely remembered the names men like Holly's Brand had used for the project in its first weeks. What survived were the things that worked. A wall of packed snow, a corridor of still air, a grandmother's voice carrying across an ocean, and 4 decades to a windswept rise in Dakota territory. A lesson handed from one generation to the next in the only language winter ever truly understood. Somewhere beyond every horizon, another storm was always waiting. When it arrived, it searched for walls just as it always had. Sometimes the strongest wall a family ever built did not look like a wall at all. Sometimes it looked like a drift. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more tales of frontier wisdom and quiet courage. And in the comments below, tell us where you're watching from, what country, what town. We love hearing from every corner of the world where these stories find a home.